The horse would not go faster, no matter how hard Alistair Grayson pressed his heels into its sides. The road to the chapel stretched on, wet with morning rain, and every second felt like a wasted breath. He had ridden through the night without rest, without food, without a single thought except one. He had to stop the wedding. He could see the spire of the chapel now, gray against the pale sky, and his chest tightened with a fear he had never known before. Not fear of losing a fight, not fear of losing his title or his land, but the fear of losing the only woman he had ever loved to another man's ring. Evangeline Whitmore was getting married that morning, and Alistair had found out only hours ago, from a stable boy who mentioned it as if it were common gossip, as if the news had not just shattered the ground beneath his feet. He pushed the horse harder. The animal's breath came out in white clouds, its hooves striking the mud in a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding in his own chest. He thought of her face, the way she used to laugh when he teased her about her stubbornness, the way her eyes would soften when she thought no one was watching. He thought of the promise he made to her 2 years ago, a promise he had broken not by choice, but by circumstance he never explained. His father had been dying. The estate had been drowning in debt. Alistair had left without a proper goodbye, believing a short letter would be enough to hold her heart until he returned. He had written to her every month. He had told her to wait. He had told her he would come back for her. But she was not waiting anymore. The chapel came into full view as he rounded the final bend in the road. Carriages lined the path, their horses standing still and patient, unaware of the storm rushing toward them. Alistair pulled hard on the reins and swung down from the saddle before the horse had even fully stopped, stumbling forward with legs stiff from hours of riding. He ran. The heavy wooden doors of the chapel stood closed, but he could hear voices inside, faint and steady, carried through the old stone walls. He grabbed the iron handle and pushed with all the strength left in his body. The doors groaned open. Every head in the chapel turned toward him at once. Rows of guests in fine clothing stared, some with confusion, some with quiet judgment, as if a wild animal had wandered into a sacred place. Alistair stood in the doorway, breathing hard, rain still dripping from his coat, his boots covered in mud that stained the polished floor. At the front of the chapel stood Evangeline. She wore a gown the color of soft ivory, her dark hair pinned back with small white flowers, and for one moment, Alistair forgot how to breathe. She looked exactly as he remembered her, and yet somehow different, older, in a way that had nothing to do with years. Beside her stood a tall man with calm gray eyes, his hand resting gently over hers, Lord Julian Hartwell. The priest had already spoken the final words. The rings had already been exchanged. Alistair had arrived 1 moment too late. He felt the weight of that truth settle into his bones like a stone dropped into still water. He had spent the entire ride imagining this moment differently, imagining himself bursting through the doors just in time, imagining Evangeline turning to him with relief and forgiveness in her eyes. Instead, he found himself standing in the doorway of a wedding that had already happened, an intruder in a moment that no longer belonged to him. Evangeline's eyes met his across the length of the chapel. There was no scream, no gasp, no dramatic collapse. She simply looked at him, steady and composed, though he could see something flicker behind her eyes, something that might have been surprise, or grief, or both at once. Julian's hand tightened slightly over hers, not out of anger, but as if to remind her that he was there, that he was real, that whatever had just walked through those doors did not change what had already been done. The priest cleared his throat, unsure whether to continue or pause. The silence in the chapel stretched unbearably long, filled only by the sound of rain against the windows and the ragged breathing of a man who had ridden through the night for nothing. "Alistair," Evangeline said finally, her voice calm and clear enough to carry through the quiet chapel, "you should not be here." The words cut deeper than any shout could have. He had expected anger. He had expected tears. He had not expected this quiet, steady acceptance, as if she had already made peace with a wound he did not yet understand. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, stepping further into the chapel, ignoring the murmurs rising from the guests around him. "Evangeline, please. Just give me a moment. Just 1 moment to speak with you." "The ceremony is finished," Julian said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of a man who had no intention of backing down. "Whatever you have to say, I do not think this is the time." Alistair looked at him, taking in the steadiness in his posture, the protective way he stood beside Evangeline, and felt something twist painfully in his chest. He had imagined this man 100 times since hearing the news, imagined him as cruel, as unworthy, as someone Evangeline had settled for out of desperation. But standing there, Julian looked nothing like that. He looked like a man who belonged exactly where he stood. I only want to understand, Alistair said, his voice quieter now, the desperation of the ride slowly giving way to something closer to grief. I wrote to you. I wrote to you every month for a year. I told you to wait for me. Evangeline's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for him to see the pain beneath it. I never received a single letter from you, she said. Not one, Alistair, not in a year. The words landed like a blow. Alistair opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had believed, all this time, that his letters had simply gone unanswered, that Evangeline had chosen silence as her response to his absence. It had never occurred to him that she might never have read them at all. The guests around them began to whisper, the sound rising like a wave threatening to break. Julian raised a hand slightly, a silent request for calm, and the chapel quieted once more, though the tension in the air remained thick enough to touch. This is not the place for this conversation, Julian said, his eyes steady on Alistair. If you wish to speak with my wife, you may do so later, in private, but I will not have her wedding day turned into a spectacle. His wife. The word struck Alistair harder than anything else that had been said. It was final, was real. Whatever chance he believed he still had, whatever fragile hope had carried him through the night, dissolved the moment that word left Julian's mouth. Evangeline looked at Alistair one last time, and in her eyes, he saw something he had never expected to find there. Not hatred, not even sorrow, not entirely. Something closer to acceptance, as if she had already grieved the version of her life that included him, long before this day ever arrived. Go home, Alistair, she said softly. Please. He wanted to argue. He wanted to demand answers, to unravel the mystery of the missing letters right there in front of everyone, to fight for something he had let slip through his fingers, through his own long silence and delay. But looking at her standing beside Julian, at the quiet dignity in her expression, he understood that whatever he said next would not change what had already happened. He stepped back, his boots leaving muddy prints on the chapel floor, evidence of a desperate ride that had accomplished nothing. I am sorry, he said quietly, though he was not entirely sure if the words were meant for her, for himself, or for the 2 years he had lost through his own mistakes. He turned and walked out of the chapel, the doors closing heavily behind him, sealing away the life he had once imagined for himself. Outside, the rain had softened into a light mist, and his horse stood waiting, exhausted and patient, much like he now felt inside. He did not mount the horse right away. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed doors of the chapel, replaying every word Evangeline had spoken. Not one letter, not a single letter had reached her in an entire year. Someone had made sure of that. The thought settled into him slowly, replacing his grief with something sharper, something closer to suspicion. He had written faithfully, every month, exactly as he promised. If none of those letters had reached her, then someone had deliberately kept them from her hands. And Alistair intended to find out exactly who. He finally climbed onto his horse, the animal shifting beneath him, sensing the change in its rider's mood. The desperate urgency of the ride here had transformed into something colder, steadier, more determined. He had lost Evangeline. That truth was undeniable now, sealed by vows spoken in a chapel he arrived at too late to stop. But he was not willing to accept that the past 2 years had been shaped entirely by chance and misfortune. Someone had taken something from him, deliberately and quietly, and he intended to uncover exactly who that person was and why. As he rode away from the chapel, the mist swallowing the road behind him, Alistair made a silent promise to himself. He would find the truth behind the missing letters, no matter what it cost him, no matter what it revealed. And whatever answers waited for him at the end of that search, he suspected they would change far more than just his understanding of the past year. They might change everything he thought he knew about the people closest to him. As the horse carried him further from the chapel, the events of the past year began to replay in his mind with a clarity he had not allowed himself before. He remembered sealing each letter with careful hands, choosing his words with the kind of honesty he rarely offered anyone else. He remembered handing them to the estate courier, trusting the man completely, never once questioning whether they would reach their destination. It had seemed impossible that anything could go wrong with something so simple. He thought of his father's final months, the long nights spent at his bedside, the endless meetings with lawyers and creditors who circled the family estate like vultures waiting for the old man to take his last breath. Alistair had been so consumed by grief and obligation that he never paused to consider whether anyone around him might have reasons to keep him isolated, distracted, and far from home for as long as possible. Someone had benefited from his absence. That much was becoming clear to him now. And if someone had gone through the trouble of ensuring his letters never reached Evangeline, then that same person likely had a reason to want him kept away from her for as long as possible. The road grew quieter as he moved further from the chapel, the sound of his horse's hooves the only companion to his racing thoughts. He passed familiar hedgerows and fields he had known since childhood, yet none of it felt familiar anymore. Everything around him seemed to belong to a life he no longer recognized, a life built on assumptions that had just been proven false. He thought of Evangeline's voice, steady and quiet, telling him she had never received a single letter. He thought of the years she must have spent believing he had abandoned her without explanation, without even the courtesy of a final word. The guilt of that realization settled heavily in his chest, mixing uncomfortably with his growing suspicion of the people around him. By the time the outline of his own estate appeared in the distance, gray stone walls rising against a clearing sky, Alistair had made his decision. He would not simply accept what had happened as misfortune or coincidence. He would return home, gather every servant who had handled his correspondence, and demand the truth, no matter how long it took or who it implicated. Evangeline was married now. That reality could not be undone. But the truth behind the missing letters still belonged to him, and he intended to claim it, even if it meant confronting people he had trusted his entire life. He rode through the gates of his estate as the last of the morning mist finally lifted, revealing a clear, cold sky above him. Somewhere within these walls, someone held the answer he needed, and Alistair was no longer willing to remain in the dark. The wedding breakfast at Hartwell Manor was already underway when Evangeline slipped away from the crowded hall, her heart still pounding from the scene at the chapel. She found the small garden behind the eastern wing, quiet and untouched by the celebration, and pressed her hand against the cold stone wall to steady herself. She had not expected Alistair to come, not after a year of silence, not after she had finally allowed herself to believe he was never coming back at all. Footsteps approached from behind her, and she turned to find Julian standing there, his expression calm but his eyes searching hers with quiet concern. "You do not have to explain anything to me," he said gently. "But I could see it troubled you, what he said about the letters." Evangeline exhaled slowly, wrapping her arms around herself despite the mild morning air. "I do not understand how it is possible. I waited for word from him for months. I checked every post that arrived at my father's house. There was nothing, not a single line." "Do you believe him?" Julian asked, his voice careful, free of jealousy or accusation, simply honest curiosity. She considered the question longer than she expected to. "I do not know what to believe. But I know Alistair well enough to say he does not lie easily. Whatever happened, I think he genuinely believes he wrote to me." Julian nodded slowly, absorbing her words without judgment. "Then perhaps someone did not want those letters to reach you." The thought had already crossed Evangeline's mind, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel more real, more unsettling. Someone had interfered in her life, had shaped the course of her future without her knowledge or consent, and she had no idea who or why. "It does not change anything between us," Julian added, stepping closer. "I want you to know that, whatever the truth turns out to be, I did not marry you as a replacement for someone else's mistake. I married you because I chose you, deliberately, with clear eyes." Evangeline looked up at him, studying the sincerity in his expression. She had known Julian for only a few months before their engagement, far less time than she had known Alistair, and yet in some ways, she felt she understood him more clearly. He did not hide behind grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He simply showed up, consistently, quietly, in ways that had slowly earned her trust. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not making this harder than it already is." He offered her a small smile, the kind that reached his eyes without needing words to explain itself, and extended his hand toward her. "Come. Our guests are waiting, and I think it best if we return before the whispers grow louder than they already have." She took his hand, allowing him to lead her back toward the manor, though her mind remained tangled in questions she could not yet answer. Who would want to keep Alistair's letters from reaching her? And why? Inside the hall, her closest friend, Charlotte Pembroke, met her near the entrance with a knowing look and 2 glasses of wine already in hand. Charlotte had known Evangeline since childhood, and she had also known Alistair, having watched their courtship unfold years earlier, from the edge of every ballroom they ever shared. "You look as though you have seen a ghost," Charlotte said, pressing a glass into Evangeline's hand. "In a manner of speaking, I have," Evangeline admitted quietly, glancing toward the crowd of guests, still murmuring about the morning's interruption. Charlotte studied her friend's face carefully. "Do you want my honest opinion, or my polite one?" "Your honest one. Always." I never trusted the silence, Charlotte said. When Alistair stopped writing, I always thought it strange. He was many things, but careless with you was never one of them. I said as much to you a dozen times, if you recall. Evangeline managed a tired smile. You did. I did not want to believe you. Well, now it seems there may be truth in it after all. Charlotte glanced toward the doorway where Julian stood speaking politely with a group of relatives, his manner unhurried despite the day's chaos. For what it is worth, I think you have chosen well regardless of what happened with the letters. That man has not once taken his eyes off you all evening, not out of suspicion, but out of devotion. Evangeline followed her friend's gaze, watching Julian laugh softly at something one of his cousins said, his attention drifting back toward her within moments, as if some invisible thread kept pulling him toward her presence. I know, she said softly. I only wish I understood the rest of it. The not knowing troubles me more than I expected it to. Then find out, Charlotte said simply. You have never been the sort of woman who lets a mystery rest unsolved. The words stayed with Evangeline for the remainder of the evening, echoing quietly beneath the polite conversations and forced smiles required of a new bride. Miles away, Alistair sat in his father's old study, a room he had avoided since the funeral, surrounded by ledgers, correspondence, and the lingering scent of aged paper and pipe smoke. Across from him stood Edmund Price, the estate steward who had served the family for over a decade, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension filling the room. I want to know exactly how the outgoing post was handled during my absence, Alistair said, his voice steady but firm, the exhaustion of the morning's ride replaced entirely by cold determination. As it always has been, my lord, Edmund replied smoothly. Letters were collected weekly and sent to the village post through the usual courier. And incoming correspondence addressed to me or sent on my behalf to Whitmore House? A flicker of hesitation crossed Edmund's face, so brief that Alistair might have missed it had he not been watching closely. I handled the estate's correspondence as instructed, my lord, nothing more. Alistair studied him for a long moment, weighing the steadiness of his voice against the flicker of unease in his eyes. He had known Edmund since childhood, had trusted him without question during the difficult months of his father's illness. But trust, he was beginning to realize, could be misplaced without ever revealing itself until it was too late. I rode to Whitmore House this morning, Alistair said, watching Edmund's reaction carefully. Lady Evangeline informed me she never received a single letter from me in an entire year. Not one. Edmund's composure remained mostly intact, though his hands, clasped behind his back, tightened almost imperceptibly. That is troubling news, my lord. Perhaps the post was lost along the road. These things happen more often than one might expect. Every letter, Edmund? For an entire year? Alistair's voice sharpened, cutting through the practiced calm of the steward's response. That is not misfortune. That is deliberate. I would not know anything about that, my lord, Edmund said, his tone carefully measured. I only manage the estate's affairs as you instructed. Alistair rose from his chair slowly, walking toward the window that overlooked the estate's grounds, the fields stretching wide and green beneath the clearing sky. He thought of the debts his father had left behind, debts that Edmund had managed carefully, perhaps too carefully, throughout the difficult transition of ownership. A marriage between Alistair and Evangeline would have secured the estate's future through her family's wealth, ending Edmund's influence over the finances entirely once Alistair no longer depended on his guidance. It was only a theory, but it was a theory that fit uncomfortably well. You may go, Alistair said quietly, without turning from the window. But know this, Edmund. I intend to review every ledger, every piece of correspondence, and every decision made on this estate during the past year. If I find even the smallest evidence that my letters were deliberately withheld, there will be consequences. Edmund bowed stiffly and left the study without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with a pace slightly quicker than usual. Alistair remained by the window long after the door closed, his thoughts circling the same unanswered questions. If Edmund was responsible, what had he done with the letters themselves? Destroyed them, most likely, though a part of Alistair hoped, foolishly perhaps, that somewhere within the estate's walls, proof still existed. He spent the remainder of the afternoon searching through the study's records, cross-referencing dates of correspondence sent against the courier's logs, searching for any inconsistency that might confirm his suspicions. The work was tedious, and by evening his eyes ached from strain, but he refused to stop, driven by a need for answers that had nothing to do with winning Evangeline back and everything to do with understanding exactly how thoroughly his life had been manipulated. At Hartwell Manor, the celebration continued long into the evening, though Evangeline found herself growing weary of the polite conversation and forced smiles required of a new bride. She excused herself early, retreating to the quiet of her new chambers, where Julian found her sitting by the window, staring out at the darkening gardens below. "You are thinking of him again," Julian said, not with accusation, but with quiet understanding. Evangeline turned to face him, surprised by how easily he seemed to read her thoughts. "I am thinking of the letters, of who would do such a thing, and why." Julian crossed the room and sat beside her, his presence steady and calm as it always seemed to be. "Perhaps it does not matter who did it. Perhaps what matters is what you choose to do now that it is done." "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said gently, "that whatever happened between you and Alistair, it led you here, to this moment, to this marriage. I do not believe in wasted paths, Evangeline. I believe every choice, even the painful ones, leads somewhere worth arriving at." She studied him carefully, searching for any trace of resentment or insecurity beneath his calm words, but found none. He truly seemed at peace with the complicated history she carried, unthreatened by the shadow of a man who had once held her heart so completely. "You are a remarkable man, Julian Hartwell," she said softly. He smiled, taking her hand gently in his. "I am simply a man who recognizes what he has, and intends to protect it, not through jealousy or fear, but through patience and honesty." Evangeline leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the last light fade from the evening sky, her mind still troubled by unanswered questions, yet comforted, for the first time that day, by the steady presence beside her. Whatever truth waited to be uncovered about the missing letters, she suspected it would not change the choice she had already made. But she needed to understand it, regardless, if only to finally close the door on a chapter of her life that had ended before she ever had the chance to say goodbye properly. Somewhere across the county, in a study lit only by a single dying candle, Alistair continued his search through old ledgers, unaware that the answers he sought were closer than he realized, hidden not in distant mysteries, but in the quiet betrayals of people he had trusted his entire life. Near midnight, exhaustion finally overtook him, and he set the papers aside, rubbing his eyes against the strain of hours spent squinting at faded ink. He rose from the desk and walked slowly toward the fireplace, where the last embers of the evening fire still glowed faintly against the dark. He thought of Evangeline standing at the altar, the calm certainty in her expression as she spoke of a year spent waiting for words that never arrived. He had always believed that love, if strong enough, would find its way through any obstacle. He realized now how foolish that belief had been. Love required more than feeling. It required presence, communication, proof, offered again and again, until trust had no reason to waver. He had given her feeling, but he had failed to give her proof, and in the space left by his absence, doubt had taken root and grown into something he could no longer uproot. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His housekeeper, an older woman named Margaret Fenwick, who had served the family since before his birth, entered carrying a tray of tea he had not requested but welcomed regardless. "You should rest, my lord," she said gently, setting the tray on the desk beside the scattered ledgers. "Whatever answers you seek will still be waiting for you in the morning." "I cannot rest, Margaret," he admitted, staring into the dying fire. "Not until I understand how this happened." She studied him with the quiet concern of someone who had watched him grow from a boy into a man, who had seen him through his father's illness and the heavy responsibilities that followed. "Your father trusted Edmund completely," she said carefully. "But I confess, I never fully understood why. There were always small things that troubled me. Missing coin here and there in the household accounts. Letters that seemed to vanish before reaching their intended recipients. Not just yours, my lord, but others as well." Alistair turned to face her fully, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Why did you never mention this before?" "Because it was not my place. And because I had no proof. Only suspicion," Margaret said. "But if you are searching for answers tonight, perhaps it is time someone spoke plainly about what has long gone unspoken in this house." Her words settled over him with quiet weight, confirming suspicions he had only begun to allow himself to consider fully. If Edmund had been quietly manipulating the estate's affairs for years, then the missing letters were likely only one small piece of a much larger deception, one that had shaped far more of his life than he had ever realized. He thanked Margaret for her honesty and watched her leave the study, the door closing softly behind her. Alone once more, he stared at the ledgers spread across the desk, resolve hardening within him like iron cooling into shape. Tomorrow, he would begin questioning every servant on the estate who might know something. Tomorrow, he would search every hidden corner of Edmund's records for proof, and whatever truth waited to be uncovered, however painful it might prove to be, Alistair intended to face it fully, without flinching, no matter what it cost him or who it implicated in the end. For the first time since riding away from the chapel that morning, exhaustion finally won over determination, and Alistair allowed himself to rest, if only for a few short hours, knowing the search ahead would demand every ounce of strength he had left to give. By dawn, Alistair had already summoned every servant connected to the estate's correspondence to gather in the main hall. He stood before them, exhaustion etched into his features but resolve burning steadily behind his eyes. Margaret Fenwick stood near the back, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes met his briefly with quiet encouragement. "I know some of you may find this questioning uncomfortable," Alistair began, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "But I have reason to believe letters meant to reach Whitmore House over the past year never arrived. I intend to discover exactly how that happened, and I would rather hear the truth now than uncover it later through less forgiving means." A young footman named Thomas Ellery shifted uncomfortably near the front of the group, his eyes darting briefly toward the door before returning to the floor. Alistair noticed immediately, his instincts sharpening at the small betrayal of nerves. "Thomas," Alistair said, stepping closer, "you handled the outgoing post on several occasions, did you not?" "Only when instructed, my lord," Thomas replied, his voice unsteady. "Mr. Price often asked me to deliver letters to the courier directly, rather than leaving them for collection." "And did you ever notice anything unusual about those deliveries?" Thomas hesitated, glancing nervously at the other servants gathered around him. "There were times, my lord, when Mr. Price asked me to bring certain letters back to him instead, saying he wished to review them before they were sent. I assumed it was simply part of his duties." Alistair felt a cold certainty settle over him, confirming what he had already begun to suspect. "How often did this happen?" "Several times, my lord. Perhaps once or twice a month, always with letters addressed to Whitmore House." The hall fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over everyone present. Alistair thanked Thomas for his honesty, promising there would be no punishment for speaking truthfully, and dismissed the remaining servants to return to their duties. Only Margaret remained behind, watching him carefully. "You have your proof now," she said quietly. "I have a testimony," Alistair corrected. "I still need to know what became of the letters themselves, whether they were destroyed, or whether they still exist somewhere within this house." He spent the remainder of the morning searching Edmund's private office, a small room adjacent to the estate's main study that the steward had always kept locked, citing the sensitivity of financial records within. Alistair had never questioned this practice before, trusting Edmund's judgment without hesitation. Now, standing before the locked door, he felt only frustration at his own past complacency. He sent for the estate's locksmith, a quiet man who worked efficiently and without questions, and within the hour, the door swung open, revealing a cramped room filled with ledgers, correspondence, and neatly organized files spanning years of estate management. Alistair began searching methodically, setting aside anything unrelated to his search, until his hands found a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of older ledgers, its lock simple enough to break with minimal effort. Inside, he found exactly what he had feared and hoped to find in equal measure. Letters. Dozens of them, bundled together with careful string, all addressed to Evangeline Whitmore, all bearing his own handwriting, all completely unopened and unsent. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the bundle, running his thumb over the familiar wax seals he had pressed into each envelope himself, believing at the time that his words were traveling toward the woman he loved. Instead, they had sat hidden in this small room for an entire year, silent witnesses to a deception he had never suspected. Beneath the letters, he found something else entirely unexpected. A ledger, separate from the estate's official records, detailing payments made to Edmund from an outside source, payments that coincided suspiciously with the estate's ongoing debts, and Edmund's careful management of Alistair's affairs during his father's illness. The name attached to those payments was unfamiliar to Alistair at first glance: Lord Reginald Ashby. Alistair sat back slowly, his mind racing to place the name within the context of everything he thought he understood about his own life. Reginald Ashby was a distant relative of the Whitmore family, a man known throughout society for his ambition and his carefully cultivated connections among the wealthy and titled. If Reginald had been paying Edmund to intercept the letters, then someone had wanted Alistair kept away from Evangeline for reasons that had nothing to do with Edmund's own financial motives. The pieces began arranging themselves slowly in Alistair's mind. Reginald Ashby's daughter, Margaret Ashby, had been quietly pursued by Julian Hartwell before his attention shifted entirely toward Evangeline. If Evangeline's marriage to Alistair had been prevented, perhaps Reginald had hoped to eventually secure a match between his own daughter and Julian instead, using Evangeline's isolation and eventual availability to Julian as an unintended but useful consequence. It was a theory built on assumption, but it fit the evidence uncomfortably well. Alistair gathered the letters and the ledger carefully, securing them within his coat before making his way back through the manor toward the main hall, where he found Edmund waiting, summoned by one of the remaining servants who had witnessed the locksmith's work and quietly informed him of the discovery. Edmund's composure had finally begun to crack, his usual steady confidence replaced by visible unease as he took in the bundle of letters Alistair now held. "My lord, I can explain," Edmund began, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Then explain," Alistair said coldly, setting the letters and ledger down on a nearby table with deliberate care. "Explain why an entire year of my correspondence to Lady Evangeline sits hidden in your private office. Explain why Reginald Ashby has been paying you throughout that same year." Edmund's face paled visibly, any remaining pretense of innocence collapsing entirely under the weight of the evidence before him. "Lord Ashby approached me shortly after your father's passing," he admitted quietly. "He offered payment in exchange for delaying certain correspondence, claiming it was simply a matter of protecting family interests during a difficult transition." "Protecting whose interests, Edmund? Certainly not mine." "I did not know the full extent of his intentions, my lord. I believed it to be a temporary arrangement, nothing more." "A temporary arrangement that lasted an entire year," Alistair said, his voice sharp with barely restrained anger. "An arrangement that cost me the woman I loved, Edmund. Do you understand that? Do you understand what you have taken from me?" Edmund lowered his eyes, unable to meet Alistair's gaze any longer. "I understand, my lord. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Alistair stood in silence for a long moment, weighing the anger burning within him against the practical reality of the situation before him. Dismissing Edmund immediately would satisfy his anger, but it would not undo the damage already done, nor would it fully expose Reginald Ashby's role in the deception. "You will remain in this house under close watch until I decide how best to proceed," Alistair said finally. "But know this, Edmund. Your service to this family ends today, regardless of what consequences follow. I will no longer trust you with anything of importance." Edmund nodded stiffly, offering no further argument, and was escorted from the hall by two of the household staff, leaving Alistair alone with the evidence of a year's worth of stolen truth spread across the table before him. He sat down slowly, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried him through the morning's confrontation. He stared at the bundle of unsent letters, each one a testament to feelings he had believed were reaching Evangeline throughout their entire separation. Now that he held proof of the deception, he found himself uncertain what to do with it. Evangeline was married. The truth, however clear it had finally become, could not undo the vows spoken in that chapel. And yet, he felt compelled to bring her these letters, to let her read the words he had written with complete honesty, to ensure she understood the truth of his devotion, even if that truth arrived far too late to change anything between them. He spent the remainder of the day drafting a careful letter of his own, explaining everything he had discovered, including Reginald Ashby's involvement, and requesting a private meeting to deliver both the explanation and the original letters themselves. He sent the letter by his most trusted courier, watching from the study window as the rider disappeared down the long road leading away from the estate. Meanwhile, at Hartwell Manor, Evangeline spent the day settling into the rhythms of her new life, though her thoughts remained tangled with unanswered questions from the previous day's revelations. Julian noticed her distraction throughout their quiet breakfast together, though he said nothing, allowing her the space to process her thoughts without pressure. It was Charlotte who arrived unannounced that afternoon, her expression tight with barely contained urgency, as she was shown into the parlor where Evangeline sat reading by the window. "I heard something troubling this morning," Charlotte said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her friend. "My cousin serves within the Ashby household, and she mentioned overhearing Lord Ashby speaking with someone regarding payments made to an estate steward. I did not think much of it until I recalled the conversation from the wedding." Evangeline set her book aside slowly, a cold unease settling over her at the mention of the Ashby family. What exactly did she overhear? Something about ensuring correspondence never reached its intended destination, though she could not make out further details before the conversation moved elsewhere. "I thought you should know, given everything that happened yesterday." Evangeline's mind raced through the implications of Charlotte's words, connecting them slowly to the mystery of Alistair's missing letters. Reginald Ashby had always seemed friendly enough during social gatherings, though she had never fully trusted the calculated warmth behind his interactions with her family. If he had somehow been involved in preventing Alistair's letters from reaching her, the question remained, why would he go through such trouble over a matter that seemingly had nothing to do with him? "Do you think Julian knows anything about this?" Evangeline asked quietly. Charlotte hesitated before answering. I do not know. But given how quickly Lord Ashby's daughter seemed interested in your husband before your engagement was announced, I would not be entirely surprised if there is some connection worth investigating. The suggestion settled uncomfortably in Evangeline's mind, though she pushed it aside for the moment, unwilling to entertain suspicion toward Julian without clear evidence to support it. Still, the possibility lingered at the edges of her thoughts throughout the remainder of Charlotte's visit, a quiet unease she could not fully shake. That evening, as she prepared for bed, a servant informed her that a letter had arrived, delivered by a rider who insisted it be placed directly into her hands. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her heart tightening at the familiar strokes she had once known so well. Alistair. She broke the seal carefully, her eyes scanning the careful explanation within, detailing everything he had discovered that day. The unsent letters, Edmund's confession, Reginald Ashby's involvement. By the time she finished reading, her hands trembled slightly, the weight of an entire year's stolen truth settling heavily over her. She sat by the window for a long while after finishing the letter, staring out at the darkened gardens below, her mind spinning through questions that seemed to multiply with every passing moment. If Reginald Ashby had truly been responsible for keeping her and Alistair apart, what role, if any, had Julian played in the events that followed? And more importantly, did any of it change the choice she had already made? She did not have answers yet. But she intended to find them, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth might prove to be, or how deeply it threatened to unsettle the fragile new life she had only just begun building with Julian. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it away in the drawer of her writing desk, though sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake for hours, replaying every conversation she had ever shared with Reginald Ashby, searching her memory for any hint of the calculation Charlotte's words had suggested. She remembered him complimenting her at gatherings, always warm, always attentive in a way that had once seemed harmless. Now, that same warmth felt like something closer to strategy. The following morning she found Julian in the small study he used for estate correspondence, a cup of tea cooling beside him as he reviewed a stack of papers. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening immediately at the sight of her. You look as though you did not sleep well, he said, setting his papers aside. I did not, she admitted, taking the seat across from him. Julian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, no matter how uncomfortable the question might be. His brow furrowed slightly, though he nodded without hesitation. Ask me anything. Do you know Reginald Ashby well? The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, though his expression remained open and unguarded. Well enough, I suppose. He is a distant relation to your family, and our paths have crossed at various gatherings over the years. Why do you ask? Evangeline studied his face carefully as she explained what Charlotte had overheard, and what Alistair's letter had revealed, watching for any flicker of recognition or unease that might suggest deeper involvement. Instead, she found only genuine surprise, followed quickly by a troubled frown as the implications settled over him. I had no knowledge of this, Julian said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of sincere concern. Evangeline, I promise you, I had no idea Reginald was involved in anything of the sort. I believe you, she said, and found, somewhat to her relief, that she truly did. But Charlotte mentioned his daughter had shown interest in you before our engagement was announced. I cannot help but wonder if there is some connection. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he considered her words carefully. Margaret Ashby and I were briefly acquainted through mutual friends, nothing more. I never encouraged any expectation beyond polite friendship, though I confess her father seemed unusually invested in the idea at the time. I did not think much of it then. Perhaps I should have. The admission settled uncomfortably between them, neither confirming nor fully dismissing the suspicion that had begun forming in Evangeline's mind. If Reginald Ashby had hoped to secure a match between his daughter and Julian, then delaying Alistair's letters and ensuring Evangeline's eventual availability to Julian would have served his purposes perfectly, regardless of whether Julian himself had any knowledge of the scheme. I want to speak with him directly, Evangeline said finally, resolve hardening in her voice. I want to hear whatever explanation he has to offer, if any. Julian reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. Then we will speak with him together. Whatever role he played in this, I will not have you facing it alone. She looked at him, grateful for the steady certainty in his expression, the same quality that had drawn her toward him from the very beginning of their acquaintance. Whatever complications the truth might reveal, she found comfort in knowing he intended to stand beside her through it, rather than allowing suspicion or discomfort to create distance between them. They arranged to visit Reginald Ashby's estate the following afternoon, sending word ahead to ensure he would be present to receive them. As the carriage carried them along the familiar roads toward his family's grand estate, Evangeline found her thoughts returning again and again to Alistair's letter, to the bundle of unsent words that had waited an entire year to reach her, and to the man who had ridden through the night believing he still had a chance to stop a wedding that fate, or perhaps deliberate manipulation, had already set in motion long before he ever learned the truth. Whatever Reginald Ashby had to say for himself, she suspected his explanation would only be the beginning of a much larger reckoning still waiting to unfold. As the carriage rounded the final bend before the Ashby estate came into view, Evangeline glanced once more at Julian beside her, steady and calm despite the uncertainty of what awaited them. She thought of Alistair, riding through the rain toward a chapel he reached one moment too late, and of the letters that had sat hidden for a year, silent witnesses to a truth neither of them had been allowed to know. She thought of the choices that had shaped her life without her knowledge or consent, and of the choice she still had left to make now that the truth was finally beginning to surface. Whatever answers waited behind the tall iron gates ahead, she intended to meet them with the same steady resolve Julian had shown her from the very beginning, unwilling any longer to let silence or deception dictate the course of her life. The carriage slowed as it approached the gates, and Evangeline drew a slow breath, preparing herself for whatever truth Reginald Ashby was about to reveal. Reginald Ashby received them in his study, his expression carefully composed despite the evident surprise of their unannounced visit. He was a tall man, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of practiced warmth that had always struck Evangeline as slightly too polished to be entirely genuine. "Lady Hartwell, Lord Hartwell," he greeted them smoothly, gesturing toward the chairs across from his desk. "This is an unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe the visit?" Evangeline remained standing, unwilling to soften the directness of her purpose with polite formalities. "We know about the payments, Lord Ashby. We know about Edmund Price, and the letters he intercepted on your instruction." Reginald's composure flickered, just briefly, before settling back into practiced calm. "I am afraid I do not know what you are referring to." "Please do not insult us with denial," Julian said evenly, stepping forward beside his wife. "We have the ledger. We have Edmund's confession. What we do not have is your reason, and I think you owe us that much honesty, at the very least." The room fell silent for a long moment, Reginald's gaze moving between them as he weighed the value of continued denial against the evident futility of the effort. Finally, he sighed, some of the practiced warmth draining from his expression, replaced by something closer to weary resignation. "Sit down," he said quietly. "Both of you. I will explain, though I doubt the explanation will satisfy either of you." They took the offered seats, and Reginald moved to stand near the window, his back partially turned toward them as he began to speak. "My daughter Margaret has always struggled to secure a favorable match," he said slowly. "She is a wonderful young woman, but society can be cruel toward those who do not fit its narrow expectations, and offers for her hand have been fewer than I would have liked. When Lord Hartwell began showing interest in her, I saw an opportunity I was not willing to lose easily." "So you decided to remove the competition," Evangeline said, her voice sharp with barely restrained anger. "I decided to delay an inconvenience," Reginald corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless given the consequences. "I learned that Alistair Grayson intended to write to you throughout his absence, and I recognized that if those letters continued reaching you uninterrupted, your engagement to him upon his return would be all but guaranteed. I approached Edmund Price, offered him payment in exchange for delaying the correspondence, believing that enough time and silence would naturally push you toward considering other prospects, namely, Lord Hartwell, who I hoped might eventually turn his attention toward my daughter once his interest in you cooled. Instead, his interest in me only grew," Evangeline said quietly, glancing toward Julian, who remained silent beside her, his expression unreadable. "Yes," Reginald admitted. "A miscalculation on my part, I confess. I did not anticipate that removing one suitor from your life would simply clear the path for another, rather than leaving you available for my own purposes." The cold calculation behind his words settled uncomfortably over the room, confirming everything Evangeline had feared without offering the comfort of a more sympathetic motive. An entire year of her life, an entire year of Alistair's devotion, discarded and hidden away simply because it stood inconvenient to one man's ambitions for his daughter. "You cost him a year of his life," Evangeline said, her voice trembling slightly with barely contained fury. "You cost me a year of believing the man I loved had abandoned me without explanation. Do you understand what that did to me? Do you understand what it might have cost had circumstances unfolded differently? Reginald had the decency to look genuinely uncomfortable at the accusation, though he offered no further apology beyond a stiff nod of acknowledgement. I am not proud of the choice I made. But I will not pretend it was entirely without reason. A father's concern for his daughter's future can drive him toward decisions he might not otherwise consider. That does not excuse what you did, Julian said finally, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that Evangeline had rarely heard from him before. You manipulated the lives of people who trusted the world to be honest with them. Whatever concern you carry for your daughter, it does not grant you the right to reshape other people's futures without their knowledge or consent. Reginald's jaw tightened, though he offered no argument against the accusation. What do you intend to do with this information? Evangeline exchanged a glance with Julian before answering. I have not yet decided, but know this, Lord Ashby. Whatever consequences follow from this conversation, they will be consequences you have earned through your own choices. They left shortly after, the carriage ride back toward Hartwell Manor filled with a heavy silence neither of them seemed inclined to break immediately. Evangeline stared out the window, watching the countryside pass in a blur of green and gray, her mind still processing the full weight of Reginald's confession. You have been quiet since we left, she said finally, glancing toward Julian. He was silent for a moment longer before answering, his gaze distant, as though weighing something carefully within himself. I need to tell you something, Evangeline. Something I should have told you before we married, though I convinced myself it did not matter enough to mention. A cold unease settled over her at the seriousness in his voice. What is it? I knew, he said quietly. Not about the letters, not about Reginald's scheme, I promise you that much. But I knew, before we ever became engaged, that you loved Alistair Grayson. I saw it in the way you spoke of him, even in his absence. I saw it in the quiet sadness that never fully left your eyes during the months we grew closer. Evangeline felt her breath catch slightly, uncertain where this admission was leading. Why did you never say anything? Because I believed, foolishly perhaps, that I could earn your heart honestly, over time, regardless of what feelings still lingered for him, Julian said. I did not pursue you as a convenient alternative, Evangeline. I pursued you because I admired you long before Alistair ever left for his father's estate. I watched you from a distance for years, never quite finding the courage to approach you while his attention remained clearly fixed on you. When he left, and his letters seemed to stop arriving, I saw an opportunity, and I will not pretend otherwise. But my intentions were never dishonest. I wanted to earn your affection through patience and consistency, not through manipulation or deception. The confession settled over her slowly, reshaping her understanding of the man she had married. She had always believed Julian's steady devotion was simply his nature, uncomplicated and straightforward. Now she understood it carried its own quiet complexity, its own careful patience built around feelings he had held long before circumstances ever brought them together. Are you angry with me? He asked softly, watching her carefully for her reaction. She considered the question honestly before answering. I do not think so. I think I understand. In a strange way. You showed up consistently, Julian, even while knowing my heart still carried unfinished feelings for someone else. That took a kind of courage I am not certain I would have found in your position. Relief flickered across his face, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease. There is something else, he said carefully. Something I think you should know, given everything Reginald just confessed. What is it? When your feelings toward Alistair remained unresolved, even after his letters stopped arriving, I considered stepping aside entirely, allowing you the space to wait for him, should he ever return. But then I learned, through mutual acquaintances, that Reginald had been quietly spreading rumors suggesting Alistair had formed an attachment to another woman during his absence. I did not know at the time that those rumors were false, deliberately planted to hasten your consideration of other prospects. I allowed myself to believe them, because believing them made it easier to pursue you without guilt. Evangeline stared at him, the full scope of Reginald's manipulation settling over her with fresh clarity. Not only had he intercepted Alistair's letters, he had actively spread false rumors to accelerate her availability. Rumors that had shaped Julian's own choices without his full awareness of their origin. You did not know they were false, she said slowly, working through the implications carefully. You believed them, just as I believed Alistair's silence meant abandonment. Yes, Julian admitted, though that does not entirely absolve me of using the rumors to justify my own pursuit of you, even when I suspected they might not tell the whole truth. Evangeline reached across the carriage, taking his hand gently in hers, surprising him with the gesture. Julian, I do not think either of us acted with dishonest intentions. We were both navigating a situation shaped entirely by someone else's deliberate deception. I cannot fault you for choices made without full knowledge of the truth. He studied her carefully, searching her expression for any trace of resentment or doubt, finding instead a steady sincerity that eased the tension he had carried since beginning this difficult confession. Thank you for understanding, he said quietly. I did not want secrets to exist between us, especially not ones connected so closely to Reginald's scheme. As the carriage continued its journey back toward Hartwell Manor, Evangeline found herself reflecting on how deeply Reginald's manipulation had reached, touching not only her relationship with Alistair, but the very foundation of her marriage to Julian as well. The truth, now fully uncovered, left her with complicated feelings she had not yet fully processed, feelings that would require careful thought in the days ahead. Whatever came next, she understood that both Alistair and Julian had been navigating a landscape deliberately reshaped by Reginald Ashby's ambition, each making choices based on incomplete truths neither of them had any reasonable way of questioning at the time. The question now was what she intended to do with the fuller truth she finally possessed, and how it might reshape the delicate balance of the life she had only just begun building. As their carriage passed through the final stretch of road leading toward Hartwell Manor, a second carriage approached from the opposite direction, slowing as it drew closer. Evangeline recognized the crest immediately, and her heart quickened as the carriage came to a stop alongside their own. Alistair stepped out, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination, clearly having traveled the same road toward Reginald Ashby's estate with intentions of his own. You have already been to see him, Alistair said, reading the truth in their expressions before either of them spoke a word. We have, Julian confirmed, stepping down from the carriage to stand beside his wife. He confessed everything. The letters, the payments to Edmund, the reasons behind them. Alistair's jaw tightened, though something in his posture eased slightly, as though relieved to no longer be the only one carrying the weight of the discovery. Then you know about Margaret Ashby as well, about his hopes for her future. We do, Evangeline said quietly, studying Alistair carefully, noting the fatigue etched into his features from what had clearly been another sleepless night spent chasing answers. Alistair, there is more. Julian has told me things about the rumors Reginald spread, rumors that shaped choices none of us made with full knowledge of the truth. Before Alistair could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps drew their attention toward the Ashby estate gates, where a young woman emerged, her expression anxious as she approached the small gathering. Margaret Ashby, Reginald's daughter, arrived breathless, having clearly overheard enough of the earlier conversation from within the house to understand the scope of her father's actions. Please, she said, addressing all three of them at once, her voice trembling slightly. I need you to know, I had no knowledge of what my father did. I would never have wanted happiness built on someone else's suffering, least of all yours, Lady Hartwell. Evangeline studied the young woman carefully, searching for any trace of deception, finding instead only genuine distress. I believe you, Margaret. I never encouraged Lord Hartwell's attention beyond simple friendship, Margaret continued, glancing briefly toward Julian, who nodded in quiet confirmation. Whatever my father hoped to arrange, it was never something I asked for, nor something I would have accepted, had I known the cost. Alistair studied the young woman for a long moment before speaking. Your father caused a great deal of harm, Miss Ashby, whether or not you were aware of his methods, but I do not believe children should bear the full weight of their parents' choices, provided they are honest enough to acknowledge the harm once it comes to light. Margaret nodded, gratitude flickering across her troubled expression. Thank you for saying so. I intend to speak with my father directly about what he has done. I cannot undo the harm already caused, but I will not allow him to believe I approved of such methods, regardless of any benefit they might have offered me. She excused herself shortly after, returning toward the estate to confront her father directly, leaving the three of them standing together on the quiet road, the weight of the day's revelations settling heavily over all of them. What happens now? Alistair asked finally, looking toward Evangeline with a question that carried far more meaning than the simple words suggested. Evangeline considered the question carefully, aware of Julian standing steadily beside her, aware of Alistair standing before her with the same devotion that had once defined their entire relationship, now complicated by a year of separation neither of them had chosen. Now, she said slowly, I think we all need time to fully understand what this truth means, before any of us decide what comes next. Alistair nodded, though the disappointment in his expression was difficult to fully mask. He glanced toward Julian, offering a small, tired nod of acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition passing between the two men despite the tension of their shared circumstances. I will not pretend this changes nothing for me, Alistair said quietly, but I understand this is not a decision that belongs to me alone. He returned to his carriage shortly after, leaving Evangeline and Julian standing together on the quiet road, the truth of Reginald Ashby's deception now fully exposed. Yet the path forward still uncertain, still shadowed by feelings and choices that would require far more than a single confession to fully resolve. The week following the confrontation at Reginald Ashby's estate passed slowly for Alistair, filled with the tedious but necessary work of untangling the damage caused by a year of quiet deception. He formally dismissed Edmund Price from all remaining duties, choosing not to pursue legal consequences against the man, largely at Margaret Fenwick's gentle urging that mercy, tempered with firmness, often served a household better than punishment alone. Edmund left the estate quietly, his reputation among the local gentry irreparably damaged by whispers that had already begun circulating through the county. Reginald Ashby's situation proved more complicated. Without concrete legal grounds to pursue formal charges, Alistair found himself limited to the quieter consequences of social reputation, a currency that carried its own weight among the titled families of the region. Word of Reginald's scheme spread gradually, carried through careful conversations among mutual acquaintances, until invitations to prominent gatherings grew noticeably scarcer for the Ashby family. It was not the justice Alistair might have once demanded in anger, but it was consequence enough, delivered without further harm to Margaret, who had done nothing to deserve the fallout of her father's ambition. Margaret herself sent a brief letter to Alistair during that week, thanking him for his earlier kindness, and informing him that she intended to spend time with distant relatives in the north, away from the discomfort her father's exposed scheme had created within their household. Alistair replied graciously, wishing her well, understanding all too clearly what it felt like to have one's future reshaped by choices beyond one's own control. Throughout those long days of estate business and quiet reckoning, Alistair found his thoughts returning again and again to the conversation he still needed to have with Evangeline. He drafted several letters requesting a meeting, discarding each one for sounding either too desperate or too detached, until finally settling on words that felt honest without demanding anything beyond what she was willing to offer. He thought carefully about what he intended to say to her, rehearsing the conversation countless times during long walks through the estate grounds, uncertain whether he hoped to change her mind or simply needed closure regardless of her answer. By the time he finally sent the letter, he had made peace with the possibility that her choice might remain unchanged, though a small, stubborn part of him still clung to hope that the truth might yet alter the course they seemed destined to follow. A week passed before Alistair requested a final conversation with Evangeline, sending word through a careful letter that asked, rather than demanded, a small portion of her time. He proposed meeting at the old garden behind Whitmore House, a place that had once meant something significant to both of them, back when their future together had still seemed certain and uncomplicated. Evangeline considered the request carefully before deciding to accept, informing Julian of her intentions without hesitation or secrecy. He listened calmly, his trust in her unwavering despite the complicated history the meeting represented. "Do you want me to come with you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already anticipated her answer. "No," she said gently. "I think this is a conversation I need to have alone, not because I am uncertain of my choice, Julian, but because Alistair deserves honesty, delivered directly, without anyone standing between us." He nodded, accepting her reasoning without argument, though she could see the quiet vulnerability behind his steady composure. "I trust you," he said simply. "Whatever you decide to say to him, I trust the choice you have already made." The garden looked exactly as she remembered it, roses climbing along the old stone wall, the small wooden bench beneath the willow tree where she and Alistair had once spent countless afternoons discussing dreams that now felt like they belonged to entirely different people. She found him already waiting when she arrived, standing near the bench, his posture tense with the same nervous energy she remembered from the early days of their courtship. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly as she approached. "You asked, and I felt you deserved an honest conversation," she replied, taking a seat on the bench, though she left considerable distance between them. "What did you wish to discuss, Alistair?" He remained standing for a moment longer, gathering his thoughts carefully before finally sitting beside her, close enough to speak intimately, yet respectful of the distance she had established. "I spoke with a solicitor this week," he said, "about the possibility of an annulment, given the circumstances surrounding your marriage." Evangeline's breath caught slightly at the unexpected direction of the conversation. "Alistair, let me finish," he said gently, though firmly. "I am not asking you to pursue it. I only wanted you to know the option exists, should you wish to reconsider everything that happened, given everything we now understand about Reginald's interference. I do not want you trapped in a choice made under false circumstances, Evangeline. If any part of you still wishes for a different path, I want you to know that path remains open." She studied him carefully, recognizing the genuine sincerity behind his offer, understanding the courage it must have taken to make such a proposal knowing it might be rejected. "That is remarkably generous of you," she said softly. "But Alistair, I need you to understand something, and I need you to truly hear it, not simply as words meant to soften a painful moment, but as the honest truth of my heart." He remained silent, watching her carefully, bracing himself for whatever she intended to say next. "I did not marry Julian out of spite, or convenience, or desperation born from believing you had abandoned me," she began slowly, choosing each word with careful intention. "I married him because, throughout the months we spent together, he showed up, consistently, quietly, without grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He showed up for small moments that never demanded attention, the kind of moments that build trust slowly, over time, brick by brick, until an entire foundation exists without either person quite realizing how sturdy it has become." Alistair listened, his expression carefully controlled, though pain flickered briefly behind his eyes. "You showed up once," she continued gently, dramatically, desperately, exactly when it was already too late to change anything. "And Alistair, I do not say that to hurt you. I understand now that Reginald's interference robbed you of the chance to show up consistently throughout that year, the way you clearly intended to. But understanding that truth does not undo the year I actually lived, the year I spent building a life with someone who was present for every single day of it, rather than absent through circumstances neither of us controlled. I wrote to you every month," Alistair said quietly, though there was no argument in his voice, only quiet grief. "I believed, with everything in me, that those letters were reaching you, that they were proof of my devotion, even during my absence." "I know," Evangeline said softly, "and I believe you, completely. But belief and proof are different things, Alistair. You intended devotion, but I experienced silence. Julian did not simply intend presence. He offered it, every single day, in ways I could see and feel and rely upon." The words settled heavily between them, honest and unflinching, carrying none of the cruelty Alistair might have once feared, yet all of the clarity he needed to finally understand the full truth of what had happened between them. "I think," Evangeline continued, "that love proven through consistent presence carries a different weight than love proven through a single grand gesture, however sincere that gesture might be. You rode through the night to stop my wedding, Alistair, and I will always remember the courage that took. But Julian spent months quietly earning my trust before that morning ever arrived, long before circumstances forced either of us into a dramatic confrontation." Alistair sat in silence for a long moment, processing the full weight of her words, the truth settling over him slowly, reshaping his understanding not just of what had happened, but of what love truly required to survive and grow. "I think I understand," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I spent so much time believing that intention alone should have been enough, that writing the letters, even if you never received them, somehow fulfilled my obligation to you. I never considered that love requires more than intention. It requires visible, consistent proof, offered again and again, regardless of circumstance." "Yes," Evangeline said softly, "that is exactly it." "I am not angry with you," Alistair said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. "I want you to know that, clearly and honestly. I am angry with Reginald Ashby, and I am angry with myself, for believing that love could survive on assumption alone, without ever fighting to confirm it reached you. But I am not angry with you, Evangeline. You built a life with someone who showed up for you, fully and consistently, and I cannot fault you for choosing steadiness over uncertainty, especially not steadiness as genuine as what Julian has clearly offered you." Tears gathered in Evangeline's eyes, though they did not fall, held back by the same quiet composure that had carried her through the difficult events of the past week. "Thank you for understanding, Alistair, truly." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the garden around them quiet and peaceful, carrying none of the tension that had defined their earlier conversations. Finally, Alistair rose from the bench, offering her a small, genuine smile, despite the grief still visible behind his eyes. "I will withdraw the annulment inquiry," he said, "and I will not trouble you or Julian again with questions about what might have been. You deserve a life built on certainty, Evangeline, not one shadowed by constant wondering about paths not taken." "What will you do now?" she asked, rising to stand beside him. He considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I think I will focus on repairing what Reginald and Edmund's deception has cost the estate, both financially and otherwise. Margaret Fenwick suggested I might benefit from stepping fully into my father's responsibilities, rather than continuing to operate in the shadow of decisions made during his illness. Perhaps it is time I built something of my own, rather than simply inheriting what remains of what came before. Evangeline smiled softly, genuine warmth replacing the earlier tension in her expression. I think that sounds like a wise decision, Alistair. You deserve a future built on your own terms, free from the shadows of the past year. He nodded, extending his hand toward her, not in romantic gesture, but in simple, sincere friendship. I hope in time we might find a way to remain friends, Evangeline. I do not wish to lose you entirely from my life, even if the nature of our relationship must change. She took his hand, shaking it gently, sealing an understanding between them that felt far more peaceful than either of them had expected when the conversation began. I would like that very much, Alistair. They parted ways shortly after, Alistair returning to his estate with a renewed sense of purpose, and Evangeline returning home to Hartwell Manor, where Julian waited for her in the quiet parlor, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension he had carried throughout her absence. "How did it go?" he asked gently as she entered the room. She crossed to him without hesitation, taking his hands in hers, meeting his eyes with steady certainty. "It went exactly as it needed to. Alistair understands now, fully, why I chose the life I chose. And Julian, I want you to hear this clearly, because I think you deserve to hear it as plainly as I told him. I do not regret my choice, not for a single moment. I chose you, and I would choose you again, every single time, regardless of what truths came to light afterward." Relief washed visibly over Julian's features, tension he had carried silently throughout the day finally easing from his shoulders. He pulled her gently into an embrace, holding her close with the same steady warmth that had defined their entire relationship from its earliest days. "I love you," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight that felt entirely different from anything spoken between them before, free now of any lingering uncertainty about the shadow of Alistair's presence in her heart. "I love you too," Evangeline replied, resting her head against his shoulder, finally feeling the last of the week's tension dissolve into quiet peace. That evening, Charlotte arrived for a brief visit, having heard through the county's ever-active gossip that Evangeline had met privately with Alistair earlier that day. She found her friend in far better spirits than she had anticipated, curled comfortably beside Julian in the parlor, the two of them sharing quiet conversation over tea. "I expected to find you in tears," Charlotte admitted, settling into a nearby chair. "Instead, you both look remarkably at peace." "It was a difficult conversation," Evangeline said, "but a necessary one. I think we both needed the closure it offered, Alistair and I, though for very different reasons." "And what of the annulment he apparently offered?" Charlotte asked, raising an eyebrow with obvious curiosity, the news having clearly reached her through whatever channels carried such details through the county with impressive speed. "Withdrawn," Evangeline said simply. "I told him the truth, Charlotte. I chose Julian, and I would choose him again, regardless of what circumstances shaped the path that led me here." Charlotte smiled warmly, glancing toward Julian, who accepted the acknowledgement with a quiet, contented smile of his own. "I am glad, truly. Though I confess, I always suspected you would land exactly where you were meant to, regardless of how complicated the road proved to be." "You have more faith in fate than I do," Evangeline said, laughing softly for what felt like the first time in days. "Perhaps," Charlotte replied, "or perhaps I simply have faith in you, and in your ability to recognize genuine devotion when it stands consistently before you, rather than arriving only in dramatic, desperate moments." The conversation drifted into lighter topics as the evening continued, the heaviness of the past week's revelations gradually easing into quiet contentment. Julian excused himself briefly to attend to a small matter of estate business, leaving Charlotte and Evangeline alone for a moment of private conversation. "Are you certain you have no regrets?" Charlotte asked gently, her tone free of judgment, simply seeking honest reassurance for her friend's sake. Evangeline considered the question seriously before answering. "I do not think regret is the right word. I will always carry tenderness for what Alistair and I once shared, and gratitude that the truth finally came to light, sparing both of us the burden of permanent misunderstanding. But regret implies I wish things had unfolded differently, and Charlotte, I truly do not. Julian showed me what steady, consistent love looks like, and I do not think I would trade that lesson for anything, even the chance to undo Reginald's interference entirely." Charlotte reached over, squeezing her friend's hand affectionately. "Then I am happy for you, truly. Whatever came before, you have found something worth holding on to now." Julian returned shortly after, and the remainder of the evening passed in comfortable warmth, three friends sharing quiet conversation as the last light of day faded gently over the manor's gardens outside. Later that night, once Charlotte had departed, and the household had settled into quiet stillness, Evangeline stood by the window of her chambers, watching the moon rise slowly over the darkened grounds below. Julian joined her there, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind, resting his chin softly against her shoulder. "Thank you," he murmured quietly, "for choosing honesty today, even when it might have been easier to simply avoid the conversation altogether." "I did not want easier," Evangeline replied, leaning back against him comfortably. "I wanted certainty. And Julian, I have never felt more certain of anything than I feel standing here with you tonight." Outside, the pale moonlight settled softly over the manor's quiet gardens, marking the close of a chapter that had begun with a desperate ride through the rain, and ended, finally, with clarity, honesty, and a choice reaffirmed, not through obligation, but through genuine, unwavering certainty. 6 months passed, and the estate that Alistair had once inherited under the shadow of debt and quiet betrayal had slowly transformed into something he could genuinely take pride in. He had spent the months following his conversation with Evangeline throwing himself into the practical work of rebuilding, reviewing every ledger personally, meeting with tenants to understand their needs directly rather than relying on second-hand reports, and slowly repairing the trust that Edmund's years of quiet manipulation had eroded throughout the household. Margaret Fenwick often remarked that she had never seen him work with such steady purpose, and Alistair found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the labor brought him a satisfaction he had not expected. Where once his identity had felt tied entirely to his father's legacy and the complicated hope of a future with Evangeline, he now found himself building something that belonged entirely to him, shaped by his own decisions and his own steady effort. He had written to Evangeline twice since their conversation in the garden, brief letters sharing updates on the estate's progress, careful to maintain the tone of genuine friendship they had agreed upon rather than lingering romantic hope. She had replied warmly both times, sharing small details of her own life at Hartwell Manor, and Alistair found a quiet comfort in the correspondence, proof that some version of their bond had survived the painful transition, even if it looked entirely different from what either of them had once imagined. One particular afternoon in late summer stood out clearly in Alistair's memory, when he rode out personally to visit a tenant family whose modest farmhouse sat at the far edge of the estate, near the boundary line his father had rarely bothered to inspect during his final years. The family, headed by a weathered farmer named Peter Langley, had struggled for seasons under the weight of unfair rents Edmund had quietly imposed without Alistair's knowledge or approval, part of a pattern of small, cumulative dishonesty that had only become clear through careful review of the estate's full financial history. Alistair spent the better part of that afternoon walking the fields alongside Peter, listening carefully as the older man explained the difficulties his family had faced, difficulties that could have been avoided entirely had honest accounting practices been maintained throughout the years of Edmund's management. By the time Alistair returned to his own house that evening, he had personally adjusted the family's rent to a fair and sustainable amount, along with instructions to review every other tenant agreement across the estate with the same careful scrutiny. Peter had thanked him with quiet, genuine gratitude, remarking that he had not expected a lord to concern himself so directly with the struggles of a simple farming family. Alistair had found himself unexpectedly moved by the exchange, understanding more clearly than ever before that true leadership required presence and attention, not merely inherited authority exercised from a comfortable distance. It was a lesson that echoed, in its own quiet way, the same truth Evangeline had spoken to him in the garden months earlier. Consistency, not grand gesture, built lasting trust. He carried that lesson forward through every decision he made in the months that followed, personally reviewing tenant agreements, visiting families across the estate to understand their needs directly, and slowly earning back a level of trust and respect that Edmund's years of quiet manipulation had steadily eroded. The estate's finances improved gradually but steadily, no longer burdened by hidden debts or dishonest arrangements, and Alistair found himself taking genuine pride in watching the community around him begin to flourish under his direct, attentive care. Reginald Ashby's social standing continued its slow decline throughout those months, though Alistair found he no longer carried the same burning anger toward the man that had once consumed him. Margaret Ashby had settled comfortably with relatives in the north, and word eventually reached him that she had formed a genuine attachment to a kind gentleman there, entirely removed from her father's earlier scheming. Alistair felt genuine happiness at the news, understanding better than most the relief of building a future free from manipulation and false expectation. At Hartwell Manor, Evangeline's life had settled into a rhythm she found herself genuinely grateful for each morning she woke beside Julian. The initial complications surrounding Reginald's exposed deception had gradually faded from local gossip, replaced by newer scandals and stories that captured the county's endless appetite for drama. What remained, quietly and steadily, was the life she and Julian continued building together, free now of any lingering uncertainty about unfinished feelings or unanswered questions. She had grown particularly close with Margaret Fenwick over the months, occasionally visiting Alistair's estate for tea and quiet conversation, careful never to overstep the boundaries of the friendship they had both agreed to maintain. Margaret often spoke fondly of the changes she had witnessed in Alistair since his confrontation with the truth, praising his steady dedication to rebuilding what Edmund's betrayal had damaged. It was during one such visit, on a warm afternoon in early autumn, that Evangeline felt the first flutter of movement within her, a sensation so subtle she almost dismissed it as imagination before it repeated, unmistakable and real. She had suspected for several weeks that she might be carrying a child, though she had not yet shared the news even with Julian, wanting to be entirely certain before allowing herself to hope. That evening, she found Julian in his study, reviewing correspondence related to the estate's autumn harvest, and she approached him quietly, taking a seat across from his desk with a small, private smile she could not quite suppress. "You look as though you are hiding something," he observed, setting his papers aside with immediate curiosity. "I am," she admitted softly. "Julian, I believe I am carrying our child." The papers slipped entirely from his hands as he rose from his chair, crossing the room quickly to kneel beside her, taking her hands gently in his own, his expression a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be, without a physician's confirmation," she said, laughing softly at the emotion visible in his expression. "I intend to send for one tomorrow. But Julian, I felt movement today. I could not wait to tell you." He pressed a gentle kiss to her hands, his eyes bright with unshed tears he made no effort to hide. "This is the happiest news I have received in my entire life," he said quietly. "Evangeline, thank you. Thank you for choosing this life, for choosing me, for giving me a future I once feared I might never fully deserve." She cupped his face gently in her hands, meeting his eyes with steady certainty. "You have always deserved this, Julian. Every steady, patient moment you offered me led us here, to this exact happiness. I would not trade a single one of them." The physician confirmed her suspicion the following week, and the news spread gradually through their small circle of friends and family, met with warm congratulations from everyone, including a heartfelt letter from Alistair, expressing genuine happiness for them both, free of any lingering bitterness that might have once complicated such news. The months that followed passed quickly, filled with the quiet preparations of impending parenthood. Julian threw himself into ensuring the nursery was prepared with careful attention, while Evangeline found herself growing closer to Charlotte, who visited frequently, offering both practical advice and endless cheerful company throughout the final months of her pregnancy. Through the autumn months, Evangeline found herself growing steadily closer to Margaret Fenwick, whose calm wisdom offered comfort during moments of nervous uncertainty that occasionally accompanied her first pregnancy. Margaret visited often, sharing practical advice gathered from years of experience managing a large household, and Evangeline came to treasure these visits as much for the older woman's steady companionship as for her genuinely useful guidance. Charlotte, too, remained a constant presence throughout those months, her cheerful energy a welcome balance to the quieter, more reflective moods that sometimes accompanied the final weeks of pregnancy. She helped select fabric for the nursery curtains, insisted on accompanying Evangeline to select a small wooden cradle from the finest craftsman in the county, and teased Julian mercilessly about his growing nervousness as the expected date drew closer, though always with affectionate warmth that left him laughing despite himself. Winter arrived, bringing with it the birth of a healthy daughter, whom they named Rosalind, after Julian's late grandmother, a woman he had always spoken of with deep affection and respect. Evangeline held her daughter for the first time, with tears streaming freely down her face, overwhelmed by a love she had never quite anticipated could feel so immediate and complete. Julian stood beside them throughout the entire ordeal, his hand steady in hers through every difficult moment, his joy evident the instant their daughter's first cries filled the room. "She is perfect," he whispered, gently touching their daughter's tiny hand with careful reverence. "Absolutely perfect." The christening was held on a bright, clear morning in early spring. The chapel filled with friends and family gathered to celebrate the newest addition to the Hartwell family. Charlotte stood proudly as godmother, beaming throughout the entire ceremony, while Julian's closest friend from childhood stood as godfather, offering steady support throughout the proceedings. Among the gathered guests, seated quietly near the back of the chapel, sat Alistair, having received a warm invitation from Evangeline herself, extended with genuine sincerity rather than mere obligation. He watched the ceremony unfold with quiet contentment, free now of the desperate longing that had once consumed him entirely. After the ceremony concluded, guests gathered in the chapel's adjoining hall for a small celebration, and Alistair found a quiet moment to approach Evangeline, who stood cradling little Rosalind gently in her arms. "She is beautiful," he said warmly, genuine happiness evident in his expression as he studied the sleeping infant. "Congratulations, Evangeline, truly." "Thank you for coming," she replied, smiling warmly at him. "It means a great deal to me, having you here to share this moment." "I would not have missed it," Alistair said sincerely. "Watching you build this life, this family, it brings me a peace I did not expect to feel so completely." Julian approached them shortly after, extending a friendly hand toward Alistair, which he accepted without hesitation. "Thank you for coming, Alistair. Evangeline was hopeful you would attend." "I am glad I did," Alistair replied, studying the easy warmth between Julian and Evangeline, the comfortable, settled happiness that radiated from them both. "You have built something remarkable here, both of you." As the celebration continued around them, Alistair found himself reflecting on the long journey that had brought him to this exact moment, standing peacefully among people he had once viewed as obstacles to his own happiness, now regarded instead as genuine friends whose contentment brought him unexpected joy of his own. He thought of the desperate ride through the rain that had begun this entire story, the chapel doors he had burst through one moment too late, the year of stolen letters and quiet deception that had reshaped so many lives without their knowledge or consent. He thought of Reginald Ashby's ambition, and the consequences that ambition had ultimately brought upon his own family. He thought of Edmund Price, whose betrayal had cost so much, yet whose confession had ultimately allowed the truth to surface and heal what might have otherwise remained a permanent wound. Mostly, he thought of Evangeline's words in the garden that afternoon, words that had reshaped his entire understanding of love and devotion. Love proven through consistent presence, she had told him, carried a different weight than love proven through a single desperate gesture. He had spent months reflecting on that truth, allowing it to guide not only his understanding of what had happened between them, but his approach to every relationship and responsibility he carried moving forward. He had begun courting a quiet, thoughtful woman from a neighboring estate in recent weeks, a woman named Eleanor Whitfield, who possessed a steady kindness that reminded him, in the best possible way, of the lessons Evangeline's honesty had taught him. He approached this new possibility with patience rather than desperation, understanding now that genuine love required consistent effort, not merely intense feeling offered in isolated dramatic moments. He had met Eleanor through a mutual acquaintance at a small gathering hosted by one of his tenant families, an unassuming introduction that had nonetheless left a lasting impression. Unlike the whirlwind intensity that had once characterized his feelings for Evangeline, his growing affection for Eleanor had developed slowly, built through repeated visits, long conversations about estate matters and shared interests, and a growing comfort that felt less like sudden fire and more like a steady warmth he trusted would only continue growing with time. He had written to her just that week, promising to visit again before the month's end, and found himself genuinely looking forward to the prospect, free of the desperate urgency that had once defined his understanding of romantic pursuit. He mentioned Eleanor briefly to Evangeline later that afternoon, as the celebration continued around them, and watched genuine delight spread across her face at the news. "I am truly happy for you, Alistair," she said warmly, shifting Rosalind gently in her arms as the infant stirred slightly. "You deserve steady happiness, the same kind you helped me understand I had already found. I owe that understanding entirely to your honesty," Alistair replied, smiling genuinely. "I do not think I would have recognized what Eleanor offers, had you not helped me understand the difference between grand gesture and genuine devotion." Julian joined them again, carrying 2 glasses of wine, offering one to Alistair with easy friendliness that had grown steadily throughout the months since their difficult beginning. "To new beginnings," Julian said simply, raising his own glass. "To new beginnings," Alistair echoed, the toast carrying a sincerity that surprised even himself, given how impossible such friendly ease might have seemed a year earlier. Watching Evangeline sway gently with her daughter, watching Julian's protective, devoted presence beside them both, Alistair felt something within him finally settle into peace. He had lost the future he once believed was certain, but in its place, he had found a different kind of understanding, one that had ultimately guided him toward the possibility of building something equally meaningful with someone new, someone who might yet become as steady and devoted a presence in his life as Julian had become in Evangeline's. As the celebration continued into the afternoon, laughter and warmth filling the hall, Alistair raised his glass quietly toward Julian and Evangeline, a silent toast to the family they had built together, and to the peace he had finally found in letting go of what once seemed like his only path toward happiness. Evangeline caught his eye across the room and smiled warmly, a smile free of any lingering sorrow or complicated longing, simply the genuine warmth of old friendship that had survived, against considerable odds, the painful complications of the past year. Later that afternoon, as the celebration began winding down and guests slowly departed toward their waiting carriages, Alistair found himself walking alone through the chapel's small adjoining garden, the same kind of quiet space that had witnessed so many important conversations throughout the past year. He paused beside a bed of early spring flowers, breathing in the cool afternoon air, allowing himself a final moment of quiet reflection before returning to the celebration. He thought of the man he had been a year earlier, riding desperately through rain and darkness, believing his entire future depended on reaching a chapel before vows could be spoken. That man had understood love as urgency, as grand gesture, as a battle to be won through sheer determination alone. The man standing quietly in this garden now understood something entirely different, a truth Evangeline's honesty had helped him discover through considerable pain, but genuine growth all the same. Love, real and lasting love, required patience. It required showing up not once, dramatically, but repeatedly, quietly, through countless ordinary moments that built trust slowly over time. It required honesty, even when honesty proved uncomfortable. And it required the humility to recognize when someone else's steady presence had earned something that desperate gesture alone never could. He returned to the celebration a few minutes later, finding Evangeline and Julian standing together near the chapel entrance, little Rosalind sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, while Evangeline spoke warmly with departing guests. Alistair approached them one final time before his own departure, offering genuine well wishes and a promise to visit again soon. "Take care of each other," he said sincerely, looking between them both. "We will," Julian replied, extending his hand once more in warm farewell. "And you take care of yourself, Alistair. I have a feeling good things are waiting ahead for you." Alistair smiled, genuine warmth reaching his eyes as he glanced toward the road leading back toward his own estate, and toward the quiet possibility of happiness that Eleanor Whitfield now represented. "I believe you may be right," he said softly. He mounted his horse and rode away from the chapel at a gentle, unhurried pace, entirely unlike the desperate ride that had once carried him toward these same grounds a year earlier. This time, there was no urgency pressing against his chest, no fear of arriving too late. There was only quiet peace, and the steady, patient hope of a future still waiting to be built, one honest day at a time. Outside, spring sunlight filtered gently through the chapel's tall windows, casting warm light across the gathered guests, marking the quiet, peaceful close of a story that had once begun with desperate urgency and ended, finally, with the steady, unshakable contentment of choices made honestly and lives rebuilt deliberately, one consistent day at a time. 2 years after the christening, life at Hartwell Manor had settled into a warm, comfortable rhythm, shaped by the steady joys of family and partnership. Rosalind had grown into a curious, bright-eyed toddler who followed her father through the estate's gardens with endless questions about every flower, insect, and bird she encountered along the way. Julian indulged her curiosity patiently, often abandoning estate correspondence entirely to spend afternoons crouched beside her in the grass, answering questions with the same careful attention he had once offered Evangeline during their earliest conversations. Evangeline watched these moments with quiet gratitude, understanding more clearly with each passing season how deeply fortunate she had been in the life she chose. The complicated events surrounding her wedding day had faded into distant memory, occasionally recalled during quiet conversations with Julian, but no longer carrying the weight or tension that had once defined that difficult period of her life. She had recently discovered she was carrying a second child, news that filled the household with renewed excitement, particularly from Rosalind, who had taken to placing her small hands against her mother's growing middle each evening, whispering questions about her future sibling with endless enthusiasm. Julian found the entire display endlessly charming, often teasing that their daughter possessed more patience for the unborn child's arrival than either of her parents combined. Alistair's own life had continued its steady, patient growth throughout those same 2 years. His courtship with Eleanor Whitfield had blossomed gradually into a genuine, comfortable partnership, culminating in a quiet wedding the previous spring, attended by a small gathering of close friends and family, including Evangeline and Julian, who had traveled to witness the ceremony with genuine happiness for their old friend. The wedding had been a stark contrast to the chaos of Evangeline's own ceremony 2 years earlier. There had been no desperate ride through rain, no dramatic interruption, only the quiet, settled joy of two people who had built their relationship through patience and consistent honesty rather than urgent, overwhelming feeling. Watching Alistair exchange vows with Eleanor, Evangeline had felt a genuine warmth spread through her chest, grateful to see him finally find the steady happiness he deserved. Eleanor proved a wonderful match for Alistair, sharing his quiet dedication to the estate's ongoing improvement, and the two of them had settled into a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. She had already begun making her own mark on the household, introducing thoughtful changes to the estate's management of tenant relations. Building on the foundation Alistair had already established through his careful attention to fairness and honesty. Reginald Ashby had passed away quietly the previous winter, his final years marked by diminished social standing and the slow erosion of the influence he had once wielded so carefully throughout the county. Margaret Ashby had returned briefly for the funeral, though she had since built a genuinely happy life for herself in the north, married now to the kind gentleman she had met during her time away, entirely removed from the complicated legacy her father had left behind. Edmund Price had similarly faded from local memory, his reputation too damaged to secure meaningful employment within the county, though word occasionally reached Alistair that he had found modest work managing a smaller estate several counties away, far removed from the consequences of choices made during his years of service to the Grayson family. On a warm afternoon in early summer, Evangeline and Julian traveled to Alistair's estate for a planned visit, Rosalind bouncing excitedly in the carriage seat beside them, eager to see the gardens Alistair had described so vividly during his last visit. They arrived to find Alistair and Eleanor waiting near the entrance, both greeting their guests with genuine warmth. "Rosalind has grown so much since we last saw her," Eleanor remarked warmly, kneeling down to greet the excited toddler at her own level. "I have a small garden set aside just for young visitors, if you would like to see it." Rosalind's eyes lit up with delight, and she immediately took Eleanor's offered hand, chattering happily as the two of them wandered toward the estate's gardens together, leaving the adults to follow at a more leisurely pace. "She has a wonderful way with children," Evangeline observed, watching Eleanor's patient interaction with obvious approval. "She does," Alistair agreed, warmth evident in his voice as he watched his wife disappear around a garden hedge with Rosalind. "I think she will make a wonderful mother, when the time comes." Julian glanced toward his old friend with a knowing smile. "Is there news you have not yet shared with us?" Alistair laughed softly, a genuine, easy sound that carried none of the tension that had once defined his interactions with Julian. "Not yet, though I suspect it may not be far off. Eleanor and I have been discussing the possibility quite seriously in recent weeks." They walked together through the estate's grounds, catching up on the small details of their respective lives, the conversation flowing easily between old friends who had, against considerable odds, built genuine affection from what had once seemed an impossible situation. Alistair pointed out improvements he had made to the tenant cottages along the estate's eastern boundary, explaining the careful process of ensuring fair treatment for every family under his care, a subject he discussed now with the quiet confidence of a man who had fully grown into his responsibilities. "You have built something truly remarkable here," Julian observed, studying the well-maintained fields and content, prosperous-looking tenants they passed along their walk. "I had good reason to," Alistair replied thoughtfully. "I learned, through considerable difficulty, that presence and consistency matter more than grand intention alone. I try to carry that lesson into everything I do now, whether managing the estate or building my life with Eleanor." They eventually rejoined Eleanor and Rosalind near a small pond at the garden's edge, where Rosalind excitedly pointed out ducks swimming lazily across the water's calm surface. Evangeline settled onto a nearby bench, resting a gentle hand against her growing middle, watching her daughter's delighted laughter with quiet contentment. Alistair took a seat beside Julian on a neighboring bench, both men watching their families with matching expressions of settled happiness. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have unfolded?" Alistair asked quietly. "Had Reginald never interfered?" Julian considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "Sometimes, but I think, regardless of how the path unfolded, Evangeline and I would have found our way to each other eventually. Perhaps not exactly as it happened, but I believe some connections find a way forward, even through complicated circumstances. I used to resent the uncertainty of that thought," Alistair admitted. "Now I think I understand it differently. Whatever path each of us was meant to walk, I believe we have all arrived somewhere genuinely good." Julian nodded in quiet agreement, both men falling into comfortable silence as they watched their families enjoying the warm afternoon together. The complicated events of 2 years earlier felt distant now, transformed through time and healing into simply another chapter of a much larger, ultimately happy story. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, the small gathering made their way back toward the estate's main house, Rosalind riding happily on her father's shoulders, while Evangeline walked beside Eleanor, the two women deep in comfortable conversation about the practical realities of impending motherhood. Alistair walked a few steps behind, watching the peaceful scene before him with quiet gratitude. He thought back, one final time, to the desperate young man who had once ridden through rain and darkness, believing his entire happiness depended on stopping a wedding he ultimately arrived too late to prevent. That man could never have imagined the peace waiting for him on the other side of that painful morning, could never have understood that losing Evangeline would eventually lead him toward a different, equally meaningful happiness of his own. Love, he had come to understand fully now, was rarely as simple as grand gesture or desperate urgency suggested. It was built patiently, through countless quiet moments of genuine presence, through honesty offered even when difficult, through the steady choice to show up again and again, long after initial passion faded into something calmer, deeper, and ultimately more lasting. As they reached the house and settled onto the terrace for a simple evening meal together, laughter and easy conversation filling the warm summer air, the small household staff moved quietly around them, setting out simple dishes of roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and cold lemon water suited perfectly to the season's warmth. Rosalind sat between her parents, insisting on feeding small pieces of bread to a curious robin that had grown bold enough to approach the terrace's edge, much to the amusement of the entire gathering. "She has your patience," Eleanor said warmly to Julian, watching Rosalind carefully coax the small bird closer with quiet, gentle persistence. "And her mother's stubbornness," Julian replied, laughing softly as Evangeline swatted his arm playfully in response. The conversation drifted comfortably between practical matters and light-hearted teasing, the kind of easy warmth that only develops between people who have weathered genuine difficulty together and emerged with deeper understanding rather than lingering resentment. Alistair found himself marveling, not for the first time, at how naturally this friendship had grown between himself, Evangeline, and Julian, considering how impossible such ease would have seemed during those first difficult weeks following the wedding. As the meal continued, Eleanor turned the conversation toward the upcoming harvest season, discussing plans she and Alistair had been developing to improve storage facilities across the estate, ensuring tenant families would face fewer hardships during the harder winter months ahead. Julian listened with genuine interest, offering suggestions drawn from his own estate's successful practices, the two men falling easily into practical conversation about matters neither of them could have imagined discussing so comfortably 2 years earlier. "You should visit during the harvest itself," Alistair suggested. "Rosalind would enjoy watching the work, and I think you would find our new storage methods genuinely useful for your own tenants." "We would like that very much," Evangeline said, glancing warmly toward Julian for confirmation, which he offered readily with an easy nod. As evening deepened into a soft, golden dusk, Rosalind grew drowsy, curling comfortably against her mother's side while the adults continued their quiet conversation, the warm glow of lanterns beginning to flicker to life across the terrace as darkness slowly settled over the estate's peaceful grounds. Evangeline gently stroked her daughter's hair, watching the child's eyes grow heavy with the particular exhaustion of a joyful, busy afternoon spent exploring gardens and chasing curious birds. Julian eventually rose to prepare the carriage for their journey home, and Alistair walked with him toward the stables, leaving Evangeline and Eleanor a final quiet moment together on the terrace. "Thank you for today," Evangeline said sincerely, watching Eleanor gather empty dishes with practiced, comfortable efficiency. "It means a great deal, seeing Alistair this happy, seeing all of us able to share these moments together, after everything that happened." Eleanor smiled warmly, settling back into her seat beside Evangeline for a final moment before the evening concluded. "He speaks of you and Julian often, always with genuine affection, never with lingering regret. I think whatever pain that difficult year caused him, he has made complete peace with it now. I am grateful for that, truly. It would be difficult to build a life alongside unresolved sorrow. I am grateful for you," Evangeline said honestly, "for the happiness you have brought him. He deserves every bit of it." The two women shared a warm, genuine smile, understanding passing quietly between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the complicated history that had ultimately led all of them toward this exact, peaceful moment. Julian returned shortly after with the prepared carriage, and gentle farewells were exchanged as Evangeline carefully lifted her sleeping daughter, carrying her toward the waiting carriage while Julian and Alistair shared a final, warm handshake. Until the harvest, Alistair said, smiling genuinely. Until the harvest, Julian agreed, climbing into the carriage after ensuring his family was settled comfortably within. As the carriage pulled away from the estate, its wheels moving steadily along the darkening road toward home, Evangeline glanced back one final time toward Alistair and Eleanor, standing together near the entrance, illuminated softly by the warm glow of lantern light. She felt no lingering sorrow at the sight, only quiet gladness, understanding fully now that every difficult step of their shared history had ultimately led each of them toward exactly the life they were meant to build. Beside her, Julian reached over, taking her hand gently in his, and she rested her head against his shoulder, watching Rosalind sleep peacefully in her lap, while the carriage carried them steadily homeward beneath a sky slowly filling with early evening stars. Alistair felt the last remnants of old grief finally settle into peaceful acceptance. Whatever complicated path had brought them all to this exact moment, he found himself genuinely grateful for every difficult step along the way, understanding now that the story had never truly been about a wedding interrupted, but about the patient, honest work of building a life worth living, one consistent, meaningful day at a time.